things away as souvenirs. Come spoil our day. Remember that time we fixed it that way, huh? Remember the time you lost your... Yeah.
When I think of that winter in the Ardennes, oh boy, it looks like we were making a down payment on a trip to hell. One morning,
Yes, sir. Keep that in mind.
why did you want to see it?
Just talk over old times.
Do yourselves here, and there.
40 miles an hour, and there are more than that. Thank you. So, show. Independently, it's very tough, like the one.
Hey, nice girl. Oh, is that the way it is here?
Some war stories do not begin with victory. They begin with silence, with old wounds, with men who came home but never really escaped the battlefield. That is the strange pull of Cobra Mission. On the surface, it looks like a rugged 1980s action film built from jungle heat, military danger, revenge energy, and the kind of explosive rescue mission that defined an entire era of low-budget war cinema. But look closer, and there is something more interesting inside the box. This is not only a film about soldiers going back into combat, it is a film about men who cannot live peacefully because the past keeps calling them back. Welcome back to the film box. This is where we do not just watch a movie and move on. We slow it down, we open the frame, we look at the choices, the tension, the rough edges, the moments that work better than expected, and the moments that reveal exactly what kind of film we are dealing with. Because every film is a box, we open it together. And today, we are opening Cobra Mission, the 1986 action war film that feels like it came from a very specific cinematic moment. This was the era when movie screens were filled with haunted veterans, impossible missions, jungle warfare, military betrayal, rescue operations, and stories where the line between justice and obsession became dangerously thin. These films were not always polished, they were not always subtle, but they carried a certain raw energy, a directness, a kind of wounded masculinity that made them instantly recognizable. Cobra Mission belongs to that world. It is the kind of film where the past is not a memory, it is a battlefield waiting to reopen. The men at the center of the story are not clean heroic symbols. They feel like people shaped by violence, loyalty, guilt, and unfinished business, and that gives the film its real hook. Not simply the gunfire, not simply the mission, not simply the danger. The real hook is the question underneath everything. What happens when war ends officially but not emotionally? That question is what makes this film worth opening. Because yes, Cobra Mission gives you the classic ingredients: a team, a mission, enemy territory, personal stakes, survival pressure, and the constant feeling that something has been buried too long. But the film also carries the atmosphere of a time when action cinema was trying to process trauma through spectacle. It turns pain into movement. It turns memory into conflict. It turns regret into a rescue operation. And that is why this breakdown will not just be about what happens in the film. That would be too easy. We are going deeper. We will look at how Cobra Mission builds this world, why its roughness sometimes becomes part of its charm, how it fits into the wave of 1980s military action films, and why its emotional engine matters more than its surface might suggest. We will talk about the story, the performances, the action style, the pacing, the atmosphere, and the way the film uses the jungle not just as a location but almost like a memory trap. We will also be honest. Because this is not a perfect film, it has limitations. It has the kind of unevenness that comes with many genre films from this period. Some characters could have been sharper. Some dramatic turns ask for more emotional weight than the film can fully deliver. Some moments are built more for impact than logic. But that is part of what makes it interesting. A film does not need to be flawless to be worth studying. Sometimes the flaws show you exactly what the filmmakers were reaching for. And with Cobra Mission, what they are reaching for is clear: a hard edged story about loyalty, survival, and the cost of being unable to leave the war behind. So, as and the cost of being we open this film, keep one idea in mind: this is not just a mission movie, it is a return to danger, a return to memory, a return to a place where the characters are forced to face the part of themselves they thought they had buried. And once you see it that way, the film starts to feel different. The explosions are not just explosions. The mission is not just a mission. The violence is not just action. It becomes a cinematic language for men who do not know how to speak about what broke them. Now let's open the first layer, because the most gripping thing about Cobra Mission is not that these men go back into the jungle, it is why they cannot stay away. The hook of Cobra Mission is simple on the outside, but heavy once you start feeling what is underneath it. A group of former soldiers are pulled back toward a war they thought they had survived. Not because they want glory, not because they are chasing medals, not because they are looking for another chance to prove they are tough. They go back because something unfinished is still waiting there. And that is where the film gets its grip, because action movies often begin with a mission, a target, a rescue, a threat, a line that says, go here, do this, survive that. But Cobra Mission feels sharper when you understand that the mission is not only physical, it is emotional. These men are not just entering dangerous territory, they are stepping back into the place that shaped them, damaged them, and left them with memories they cannot easily explain to anyone else. That is the most gripping idea in the film. The battlefield is not finished with them. Picture that for a second. You survive something brutal, you return home, the world moves on. People expect you to become normal again. They expect you to work, sleep, smile, talk lightly, and pretend the past is a closed chapter. But inside, part of you is still there, still hearing it, still watching it, still wondering who was left behind, who was betrayed, and whether survival itself came with a price. Cobra Mission takes that feeling and turns it into an action story. That is why the film does not need a complicated setup to pull you in. The emotional engine is already loaded. These characters carry history before the plot even fully opens. You can feel that something has happened between them, something that does not need to be fully explained right away. Their loyalty is not casual. Their anger is not random. Their decisions are not clean. They move like men who have already lost too much. And here is what most people miss about films like this. The loudest part is not always the deepest part. The gunfire, the jungle, the military danger, the rescue energy. That is the surface. That is the box wrapped in action cinema. But inside, the film is really asking a darker question. Can a man escape a war if the war gave him his identity? That question changes everything. Because if the characters only went back for adventure, the story would feel simple. If they only went back because the plot forced them to, it would feel mechanical. But when you sense that some part of them needs this return, the film becomes more complicated. The mission becomes a test, not just of courage, but of memory, not just of strength, but of loyalty, not just of survival, but of whether the past can ever be corrected. And that gives Cobra Mission its specific 1980s power. This was a period when action cinema often turned trauma into movement. Characters did not always sit down and explain their pain. They carried it in their bodies, in their silence, in their sudden decisions, in the way they looked at danger as if danger made more sense than ordinary life. These films spoke through helicopters, sweat, weapons, ambushes, and impossible rescues because those images became a language for wounds that the characters could not say out loud. Cobra Mission fits directly into that tradition. It promises action, yes, but the thing that makes you keep watching is the emotional trap. You want to know what really binds these men together. You want to know why this mission matters so much. You want to know whether going back will save them, break them, or reveal that they were never truly free in the first place. That is the pull. Not just danger, unfinished danger, not just loyalty. Loyalty tested by memory, not just war. War returning like a ghost. And once that idea locks in, the film becomes more than a jungle action piece. It becomes a story about men walking back into the fire because the fire still has their names on it. Now let's look behind the lens. Because the way this film was made tells us a lot about why it feels so raw, direct, and unmistakably tied to its era. Before the story throws us into the mission itself, we have to look at the machine that built this film, because Cobra Mission is not just a war movie from 1986, it is a very specific kind of 1980s European war action film, shaped by the market, the mood, and the strange global hunger for Vietnam rescue stories after the huge success of American military action cinema. The first thing that changes how you watch it is the identity of the production. Cobra Mission, also known internationally as Operation Nam, is listed as an Italian and West German production, with Fabrizio De Angelis directing and also connected to the writing and producing side of the film. That matters because the film does not feel exactly like an American Vietnam picture. It feels like Europe looking at American trauma through the language of action cinema. The result is fascinating. The movie borrows the emotional ingredients of the American post-Vietnam rescue fantasy, but it filters them through a grittier, rougher, more exploitation-driven style. So when the characters talk about unfinished war and abandoned prisoners, the film is not trying to be a quiet historical meditation. It is turning political guilt into genre fuel. And that is why the tone feels so direct. The movie is not afraid of broad strokes. It does not tiptoe around its premise. It grabs the idea of veterans returning to Southeast Asia and pushes it straight into danger. That production background helps explain the film's blunt emotional rhythm. It is not built like a prestige war drama. It is built like a pressure device. The politics, the anger, the nostalgia, the rescue fantasy, the betrayal, all of it is compressed into action form. The second thing to notice is Fabrizio De Angelis himself. De Angelis is credited here as the director, and the film is part of a career that moved comfortably through tough commercial genre filmmaking. Sources also note that he sometimes used the English sounding pseudonym Laddie Ludman, which tells you a lot about how these films were packaged for international markets. That detail matters because Cobra Mission is not only telling a story, it is selling a fantasy to action audiences across borders. Look closer at that. A European filmmaker using an American style name on a Vietnam action movie about American ex soldiers. That is not accidental energy. That is the global 1980s video market in motion. The film wants to feel immediate, exportable, tough, and familiar to anyone who walked into a video store looking for soldiers, jungles, revenge, and rescue. It wants the box art to speak before the movie even begins. And when you watch the film through that lens, some of its creative choices make more sense. The characters are drawn quickly. The mission comes with big emotional stakes. The atmosphere is sweaty and urgent. The film does not pause too long to complicate every political angle, because its job is to move. De Angelis is working in a tradition where clarity and impact matter more than subtle realism. That can be a weakness, yes, but it also gives the film its pulpy force. The third production detail is the cast, and this is where the movie becomes more interesting than a simple low budget war picture. The credited cast brings together Oliver Tobias, Christopher Connelly, Manfred Lehmann, John Steiner, Ethan Wayne, Donald Pleasance, Gordon Mitchell, Luciano Pigozzi, and even Enzo Gitte Castellari in the acting credits. That lineup gives the film a strange international texture. These are not faces that all belong to one clean Hollywood system. They carry different cinematic histories with them. That matters every time the film gathers its veteran team. The group does not feel like a perfectly polished studio ensemble. It feels assembled from different corners of genre cinema, and that actually supports the story. These men are supposed to feel like survivors from different lives, people who have been scattered by time, defeat, and disillusionment. The casting gives that feeling extra weight. You sense different energies colliding. Some characters feel harder, some feel more haunted, some feel like they are hiding behind toughness because softness would destroy them. Donald Pleasance's presence is especially interesting because even a limited role from an actor with that kind of screen history changes the atmosphere around him. He brings a weary gravity. The fame may not always give every actor as much depth as they deserve, but when a recognizable genre face steps into this world, the movie suddenly feels connected to a larger library of war films, horror films, thrillers, and European exploitation cinema. It is like the film is carrying its own video store ancestry inside the cast. The fourth thing behind the lens is the writing team. Credits list Fabrizio De Angelis alongside names such as Erwin C., Dietrich, Gianfranco Clarici, and Vincenzo Manino, depending on the source. That matters because the film's story feels designed from several genre instincts at once. There is the rescue mission structure, there is the veteran trauma angle, there is the conspiracy element, there is the action survival journey. And there is also the old fashioned man on a mission shape, where each man has a function, a wound, and a reason to return. That kind of writing does not always be delicate psychology. Instead, it builds momentum through pressure. Each character is defined by what he cannot let go of. Each step toward the jungle feels like a step away from ordinary life and back into a moral nightmare. This is why even when the film's storytelling is simple, the engine underneath remains watchable. The screenplay understands one very important thing. A rescue mission only works if the characters are rescuing more than bodies. They are trying to rescue meaning. They are trying to prove that what happened to them and what happened to the men left behind still matters. The fifth layer is the look and sound of the film. The cinematography is credited to Sergio Dofisi and Ser Giorgio Salvati, while the music is credited to Francesco De Masi. That combination matters because Cobra Mission depends heavily on atmosphere. The film needs the outside world to feel harsh. It needs the jungle and military spaces to feel like a place where memory becomes physical. The visual style is not glossy in the modern sense. It has a rugged, practical texture, and that texture helps sell the idea that these men are walking into something uncontrolled. The music plays a similar role. It is not just there to decorate the action, It pushes the emotional signal forward. It gives the mission a sense of danger and fatalism, making even straightforward scenes feel like they are moving toward a reckoning. In a film like this, sound is not subtle wallpaper. It is part of the emotional command. It tells you when the past is getting closer. One more detail is worth holding on to before we enter the movie itself. The film was released in West Germany under the title Die Rückkehr der Willkür der Wildcanes and later in Italy as Cobra Mission, while other catalog sources connect it to the international title Operation Nam. That title history tells you how flexible these films had to be. Different markets needed different hooks. One title tells the return of mercenary war adventure. Another sells the sharp, dangerous mission branding. Another sells the Vietnam War rescue angle directly. And that affects how we see the movie. Cobra Mission is not just one object with one identity. It is a film built to travel, to be renamed, repackaged, and rediscovered by action fans who might meet it under completely different titles. That is part of its charm. It belongs to an era when a movie could feel almost mythic on a VHS shelf, where the title, the poster, the cast names, and the promise of jungle action were enough to make you press play. So now, with all of that behind us, the film starts to open differently. It is not only a story about veterans returning to war. It is a European action production borrowing American wounds, reshaping them through international genre cinema and delivering them with the direct impact of a 1980s combat movie. Now we can open the box properly. So what exactly is inside Cobra Mission? At its most basic level, this is a 1986 Italian-German war action film, also known internationally as Operation Now. It was directed by Fabrizio De Angelis, credited under the name Larry Ludman, and it runs on the familiar but powerful 1980s idea of former soldiers returning to Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War to search for American prisoners still left behind. The main cast includes Oliver Tobias, Christopher Connelly, Manfred Lehmann, John Steiner, Ethan Wynn, Donald Pleasance, Gordon Mitchell, Luciano Pigozzi, and Enzo G. Castellari. But that description only opens the lid. The real film is something rougher, stranger, and more emotionally loaded. Cobra Mission is a rescue movie, yes. It is a jungle combat movie, yes. It is a man on a mission story with weapons, danger, betrayal, and a hard push toward enemy territory. But at its heart, it is about the fantasy of correcting history. That is the deeper emotional charge. The characters are not only trying to bring men home, they are trying to prove that the past still matters, that abandoned lives still count, and that silence from powerful people does not erase human responsibility. That is why this film exists. It comes from a cinematic moment when the Vietnam War had become one of the biggest open wounds in action cinema. The war had ended, but the movies kept returning to it. Again and again, films imagined veterans going back, fixing what governments failed to fix, rescuing those who were forgotten, and turning national guilt into physical action. Cobra Mission belongs to that wave. It is not subtle about it. It does not hide its genre bloodline. It takes the missing in action idea and builds a direct, muscular, emotionally charged mission around it. And here is the spoiler-free verdict first. Cobra Mission is not a polished masterpiece. It is not the most elegant war film of its era. It does not have the psychological depth of the greatest Vietnam dramas or the massive production scale of bigger studio action movies. But it has a very specific pulse. It has that gritty international 1980s texture. It has a sense of man being dragged back into a nightmare because leaving it unresolved feels worse than facing it again. And if you meet the film on those terms, it becomes far more interesting than a simple action title. This is a film for you if you enjoy rugged old-school war action, practical danger, morally angry rescue stories, and movies where the emotional weight is carried less through speeches and more through movement. Men gather, a mission forms, old pain comes back to the surface. The jungle becomes the place where everything hidden has to be confronted. But if you need perfect realism, deep character psychology in every scene, or a fully balanced political portrait, this may feel too blunt. Cobra Mission is not built for quiet ambiguity. It is built for force. It takes a painful historical idea and pushes it through the engine of genre cinema. That does not make it empty, it makes it revealing. Because sometimes a film like this tells you less about the actual history it references and more about the emotional hunger of the era that produced it. People wanted stories where someone went back. Someone asked the question. Someone refused to let the missing stay missing. Someone entered the jungle not because it was wise, but because it felt necessary. And that is the heart of Cobra Mission. It is not asking whether war is glorious. It is asking what happens when men are trained to survive horror, sent home, and then expected to live with unanswered ghosts. The mission becomes the excuse. The real subject is unfinished loyalty. So before we move into the story, understand the film this way. Cobra Mission is a bruised action fantasy about return. It is about the pull of old brotherhood. It is about distrust toward official silence. It is about the belief, dangerous but powerful, that if the system will not rescue the forgotten, then damaged men may try to do it themselves. And with that, the box is open. Now we can talk about how the film actually feels when you sit down with it for the first time. The first watch feeling of Cobra Mission is not smooth. And honestly, that is part of the experience. This is not the kind of film that invites you in with elegance. It pulls you in with heat, urgency, and that unmistakable 1980s action texture where everything feels slightly rough around the edges. The world is hard, the men are harder. The emotional language is not gentle. It is built from silence, military history, suspicious authority, old friendship, and the constant feeling that something dangerous has been buried under official words for too long. I walked in expecting a straightforward jungle rescue movie, but the film gave me something more restless than that. Because from the beginning, Cobra Mission feels like a movie about men who are already carrying the ending before the story begins. There is no clean sense of peace, no feeling that ordinary life has healed anything. The characters move through the early scenes with a kind of pressure inside them. Even before the mission fully forms, you can sense that the past is still active. It is not behind them, it is circling them. That is what hooked me in the first 10 minutes. Not just the promise of action, the emotional discomfort. The film creates a world where trust feels damaged, institutions feel distant, friendship feels like the only code that still means anything. And in that kind of world, when someone says there may still be men left behind, the idea does not land like information, it lands like a wound reopening. That is the atmosphere the film builds best. You feel the weight of unanswered questions. You feel that these characters have spent years trying to live with something unresolved. And when the possibility of going back enters the story, it does not feel like an adventure call. It feels like a curse with a map attached to it. Picture this moment emotionally. A man has survived a war but not escaped it. He has made a life, or at least the shape of one. He has tried to function. Maybe he tells himself the past is finished. Maybe he has learned how to keep it quiet. Then suddenly the old world appears again. Names return, memories return. The idea of abandoned brothers returns. And with it comes a terrible choice: stay safe and live with the guilt, or go back and risk everything for the possibility that the guilt was never imaginary. That is where Cobra Mission begins to work. The opening energy is not polished in a modern way. The editing can feel blunt. The performances are sometimes direct rather than subtle. The dialogue is functional, not poetic. But the film has mood, and mood matters. Especially in a movie like this, where the emotional foundation is not built through long reflective speeches, but through the sensation of men being pulled toward a place they should probably never see again. The atmosphere has a dusty, fatalistic feeling. It is not romantic. It is not glamorous. The world of the film feels worn down. The characters look like they have already been used by history, and that helps the story. Because a cleaner version of this movie might have lost a feeling of damage. The roughness makes the emotional space feel more believable. Here's where it gets layered. The film is clearly working within a familiar action formula, but the first watch feeling is not only about formula pleasure, it is about recognition. You recognize the setup, you recognize the type of mission, you recognize the old soldiers, the dangerous territory, the official resistance, the sense that the truth has been hidden. But instead of making the film boring, that familiarity becomes part of the ritual. You are not watching because you have never seen this shape before. You are watching because you want to see how this particular film opens that shape and what kind of anger it finds inside. And Cobra Mission finds a very direct anger. Anger at abandonment, anger at silence, anger at being told to move on, anger at the idea that some lives can be erased because rescuing them would be inconvenient. That anger gives the film momentum. It pushes the characters forward even when the plot itself is simple. And in an old school action film, that emotional push is everything. Without it, the mission is just movement. With it, every step back toward the jungle feels like a step into unfinished moral territory. What makes the first watch especially interesting is how quickly the film tells you what kind of experience it wants to be. It is not trying to surprise you with delicate mystery. It is trying to grip you with purpose. It says, these men have a reason. This mission has weight. The past is not dead. And sooner or later, the box will have to open. That is why it becomes hard to look away. Because even if you can predict some of the road ahead, you still want to feel the confrontation. You want to see whether these men are chasing redemption or destruction. You want to know if going back can heal anything, or if it will only prove that the war still owns them. And that tension carries us directly into the filmmaking itself. Because the way Cobra Mission looks, moves, cuts, and sounds is not accidental. Its technique is part of its emotional language. The technique of Cobra Mission is not about beauty in the polished sense, it is about pressure. This is a film that uses roughness as texture. The camera does not feel like it is trying to make the world elegant. It wants the world to feel hot, unstable, dangerous, and physically uncomfortable. That matters because the story is not about keen heroism. It is about men returning to a damaged place with damaged memories, and the filmmaking needs to make that return feel hostile from the first step. The visual language is direct. Characters are often framed with a strong sense of function. They stand, move, watch, prepare, and react like men trained to survive, rather than men trying to express themselves. The camera understands that. It often treats bodies as instruments of tension. A soldier crossing a space is not just a person walking, it is a risk moving through the frame. A group gathering is not just a conversation, it is a tactical shape forming before the mission begins. That is one of the key technical choices in the film. Movement matters more than decoration. The camera is usually interested in where danger could come from, how exposed the characters are, and how the environment surrounds them. In a jungle action film, this is essential. The location cannot simply be background. It has to feel like pressure from every direction. Trees, shadows, paths, camps, military spaces, and open ground all become part of the emotional design. The characters are not only fighting enemies, they are fighting visibility, uncertainty, and the feeling that the past has physical walls. Look closer at how the film uses framing. The men are often placed in compositions that emphasize alertness. Faces are tense, bodies lean forward, eyes scan. The frame keeps reminding you that peace is temporary. Even when nothing explosive is happening, the image suggests that something could break open at any second. That is important because the story depends on anticipation. If the film only came alive during action scenes, the mission would feel flat. Instead, the visual style tries to keep the nerves active between the bursts of danger. The editing works in a similar way. It is not graceful in a modern, silky style. It is more blunt, more immediate, more concerned with getting you from decision to danger without too much softness in between. That bluntness can sometimes make scenes feel abrupt, but it also supports the film's old school action identity. The cuts feel like orders: move, react, prepare, survive. There is not much emotional luxury here, and that gives the movie a hard rhythm. The action staging also reflects the era. It relies on practical movement, physical geography, and the sensation of men under pressure in real spaces. You can feel the difference from modern digital action. Here, the excitement comes from bodies, locations, weapons, smoke, running, hiding, and impact. The film may not always stage action with perfect clarity, but it often has weight because the danger feels physically present. Lighting is another piece of the box. Cobra Mission does not use light to create comfort. It uses light and shadow to create suspicion. Interiors can feel closed in and tense. Outdoor scenes carry heat and exposure. The jungle atmosphere depends on contrast, the brightness of survival spaces against the darker feeling of what is hidden inside them. This matters because the whole film is about hidden truth. The characters are trying to uncover what has been buried, and the visual world keeps giving us that same feeling. Partial information, blocked sight lines, danger beyond the edge of the flame. The color and texture are very much part of the 1980s war action language. Tones, military greens, dust, sweat, and practical locations help the film feel grounded in a genre reality. It is not realism in the documentary sense, it is genre realism. The kind where the world feels believable enough for emotional investment but heightened enough for myth. These men are not simply walking to terrain, they are walking to an action memory landscape, a place where every visual detail points back to conflict. Sound and music push that feeling further. The score does not just tell you when to feel excitement, it gives the mission a sense of doom and forward drive. In a film like this, music becomes an emotional bridge between trauma and action. The characters may not explain every wound, but the score helps underline the weight they carry. It makes the mission feel less like a job and more like a reckoning. That is the technical heart of Cobra Mission. It may not be refined, but it is committed. The filmmaking wants you to feel heat, danger, loyalty, suspicion, and the pull of unfinished war. The rough cuts, the practical staging, the hard framing, the tense sound, and the rugged visual texture all serve one purpose. They make the past feel impossible to escape. And now that we understand the film's cinematic language, we can step directly into the story itself, where the mission begins to tighten around every man who chooses to go back. The story of Cobra Mission begins with the kind of wound that does not announce itself loudly at first. The Vietnam War is over, at least. That is what history says. The fighting has officially ended. The soldiers have come back. The world has moved on to new headlines, new fears, new distractions. But for the men at the center of this film, the war is not over in any meaningful emotional sense. It has only changed shape. It has moved from the jungle into memory. It has moved from gunfire into nightmares. It has moved from military orders into private guilt. That is where the film finds Richard, Roger, James, and Mark, the former soldiers whose old brotherhood becomes the engine of the story. Public synopses frame them as ex-Marines or former American veterans who decide to return to Southeast Asia after hearing reports that American prisoners may still be alive and held there. But the important thing is not simply that they hear the report. The important thing is how that report lands inside them. For ordinary people, it might be shocking news. For them, it is a call from a grave that was never closed. That is why the early part of the story matters. The film is not just assembling a team, because the genre requires one. It is showing men who are already broken in different ways. Each man seems to have tried to survive peace, but peace does not fit them cleanly. One man carries restlessness, another carries disappointment, another feels like ordinary life has rejected him. Another seems damaged by the war in a more visible, unstable way. They are not presented as clean symbols of heroism. They feel like leftovers from a conflict that used them, then expected them to disappear quietly. And this is where the movie starts pushing its real question. What do you do when the world tells you to forget people you believe are still alive? That question becomes the spark. Reports of prisoners still being held do not just create a mission, they create moral pressure. If the reports are false, then going back is madness. If the reports are true, then doing nothing is betrayal. The characters are trapped between risk and conscience, and Cobra Mission uses that trap to pull them forward. At first, their decision feels reckless, and it is. That is part of the point. These are not men carefully entering a government-approved operation with official support, clean intelligence and safe extraction waiting at the end. They are moving against silence, against doubt, against the possibility that powerful people would rather leave the past buried. So when they choose to return, the film shifts from wounded memory into movement. The team begins to form. And here, the story becomes classic men on a mission cinema. Different personalities come together under one shared purpose. They may not all be stable, they may not all agree, but they understand something about each other that outsiders cannot understand. They have history, they have battlefield trust. They have the kind of bond that does not need soft language because it was forged under pressure. That is what makes their reunion interesting. It is not warm in the traditional sense. It is not sentimental. It has the energy of men recognizing that the only people who truly understand their damage are the ones damaged beside them. The mission becomes a way to reactivate that old code. Not because war was good, but because the bond created inside war still feels more real than the empty peace that followed. Then the film sends them back towards Southeast Asia, and the story's atmosphere changes. The past is no longer something they remember, it becomes a place again, a map, a route, a threat. Every step closer to the jungle feels like the characters are moving backward to their own lives. This is one of the smartest emotional ideas in the film. The mission is geographically forward but psychologically backward. They are traveling into enemy territory, yes, but also into the version of themselves they thought they had left behind. The men who board this mission are older, more tired, more bitter, and more aware of what violence costs. But the jungle does not care. Once they enter that world again, it treats them like soldiers. In Saigon, the film introduces an important figure, the old religious man who helps guide them. Some summaries identify him as Father Lenoir, and he becomes one of the story's moral bridges. He is not just a contact, he represents something more complicated. He stands between faith and survival, between compassion and danger, between the world of hidden suffering and the men desperate to uncover it. His presence matters because it gives the mission a different tone. Without him, the story could become only military action. With him, the film introduces witness. He is someone who has seen what remains after armies leave. He understands that war does not end cleanly for the people trapped inside its aftermath. And when he helps the men move closer to the truth, the film suggests that the official version of history is not the only version worth trusting. From there, the mission tightens. The team begins to search for the camp where American prisoners are believed to be held. And this is where the film's action structure becomes inseparable from its emotional structure. Every obstacle is not only a physical threat, it is proof that the buried truth is guarded. The jungle is difficult. The enemy presence is dangerous. The information is uncertain. Trust becomes fragile. Every step forward asks the same question again. Are they rescuers? Or are they men chasing a fantasy because they cannot survive the truth of their own past? That tension gives the middle of the film its pulse. Because when they begin to see signs that the prisoners are real, the story changes. The mission is no longer about possibility. It becomes responsibility. The men are no longer acting on rumor. They are facing evidence that the nightmare continued after everyone else stopped looking. And that hits differently. The prisoners are not just people to be extracted from a camp. They are living accusations. Their existence tells the characters that something went terribly wrong, not only during the war but after it. These men were not simply lost to combat. They were left in a silence that became political convenience. That idea gives Cobra Mission its angriest emotional charge. When the rescue begins, the film becomes the action movie it has been promising. The team moves with urgency. Plans are tested. Danger closes in. The jungle becomes chaos. The mission stops being theoretical and turns into survival. The men must fight their way through the very world that once defined them. And the film uses that action to show how quickly old instincts return. That is important. These characters may be older, wounded, and out of place in civilian life. But once danger arrives, they know how to move. They know how to read fear. They know how to read fear. They know how to respond under pressure. The tragedy is that war may be the only environment where they still feel completely useful. And the film does not need to say that directly. You feel it in the momentum. You feel it in how the mission gives them purpose, even as it pulls them deeper into danger. The rescue itself is not clean. It cannot be. The Finn understands that a mission like this cannot simply become triumphant. Even success carries damage. They manage to free a significant number of surviving prisoners, but not everyone can be saved. That detail is crucial. If the film allowed a perfect rescue, the story would become simple, wish fulfillment. By leaving loss inside the victory, Cobra Mission keeps the wound open. Because the real pain is not only that prisoners existed, it is that rescue came late. Too late for some, almost too late for others, and late enough to expose the moral failure behind the silence. Then comes the deeper betrayal. The team discovers that the danger is not limited to the enemy in the jungle. The more painful enemy is political convenience. The story reveals that high level American authorities knew more than they admitted and had no real interest in exposing or correcting the situation because of larger political agreements or interests. Public summaries describe this as a secret American plot or official unwillingness to act despite knowledge of the prisoners. This is where the film's anger becomes complete, because up to this point, the mission has been about finding men left behind. But now the story becomes about why they were left behind, and the answer is not simple battlefield confusion. It is something colder, something bureaucratic, something that makes the veterans' rage feel less like personal instability and more like moral recognition. They were right not to trust the silence. They were right to believe the official story was incomplete. They were right to go back, even if going back cost them almost everything, and that discovery changes the meaning of the entire film. The jungle is dangerous, yes. The enemy camp is dangerous, yes. But the real horror is the idea that human beings can become inconvenient evidence, that survivors can be ignored because acknowledging them would disturb agreements, reputations, and political narratives. This is why the story of Cobra Mission works better when you read it as a rescue fantasy built around betrayal. The film is not only giving the audience the satisfaction of men taking action when institutions fail, it is also expressing the fear that institutions may not simply fail by accident. They may choose silence because silence is easier. By the end of the walkthrough, the mission has done exactly what these men feared and needed. It proves the past was not closed. It proves their guilt was attached to something real. It gives them purpose, but it does not give them peace, because once you uncover a truth like this, you do not get to return to innocence. You only get to decide what you will do with the knowledge, and that is where Cobra Mission becomes more than its action shell. It is about men who go into the jungle to rescue prisoners but end up exposing a moral prison around themselves. They were trapped by memory. The prisoners were trapped by war. The truth was trapped by politics. And the mission breaks those walls open, not cleanly, not perfectly, but with force. The story begins with rumor. It becomes a rescue. Then it becomes an accusation. And by the time the men understand what has really been hidden, the film's real box is no longer closed. And this is the moment the box opens completely. What Cobra Mission does brilliantly is not perfection. It is conviction. This is a film that knows exactly what emotional button it wants to press, and it presses that button with force. It understands the appeal of a mission built around abandoned men, broken trust, and veterans who cannot accept silence as an answer. That is the core strength. Even when the film is rough, even when some scenes are blunt, even when the storytelling moves with more force than finesse, the emotional engine keeps working because the mission feels personal. The acting works best when the characters are allowed to carry history without explaining every piece of it. Oliver Tobias gives the film a strong center because he does not need to overplay the pain. His screen presence works through restraint. He has the look of a man who understands that going back is dangerous, maybe even foolish, but still cannot imagine doing anything else. That matters because the film needs a leader who feels motivated by more than action movie toughness. He has to feel like someone pulled by loyalty, guilt, and unfinished responsibility. The scene that proves it is not only one big action moment. It is the quieter emotional build before the mission fully explodes, when the decision to return starts feeling irreversible. In those moments, the character's strength is not about physical dominance. It is about moral pleasure. You can feel that he knows the world will call this reckless, but he also knows that walking away would be its own kind of betrayal. Christopher Connelly also brings something valuable to the group dynamic. He has a worn down quality that fits the film's mood. He does not feel like a fresh hero entering a clean adventure. He feels like someone who has already lived through too much and is now being asked to reopen the part of his life that never healed. That kind of performance is important in a film like this because the team cannot feel like random action figures. They have to feel like men who have a shared past heavy enough to justify the mission. And then you have Donald Pleasence, whose presence adds instant gravity, even when the film does not use him as deeply as it could. His face and voice carry history. He brings a sense of moral fatigue into the frame. The film around him may be pulpy, but he makes the world feel older, sadder, and more compromised. That is a gift in a story about hidden prisoners and official silence, because the film needs someone who feels like he has seen the cost of that silence from the inside. The story construction works because it follows a clean emotional escalation. First, there is rumor, then there is belief, then there is action, then there is proof, then there is peripheral. That structure is simple, but it is effective. The film does not confuse its own purpose. It moves from uncertainty to mission, from mission to discovery, from discovery to confrontation. Each stage raises the emotional stakes. At first, the men are acting on a possibility. Later, they are acting on responsibility. By the end, they are acting against the system that would rather keep the truth buried. That is strong genre construction. The film also understands one crucial role of rescue cinema. The people being rescued cannot only be plot objects, they have to represent something larger. In Cobra Mission, the prisoners represent the failure of memory. They are the physical proof that the past did not end just because officials declared it finished. That gives the rescue emotional power. The mission is not only about survival, it is about forcing the world to admit what it wanted to forget. Direction and visuals work best when the film leans into harsh physical atmosphere. The jungle setting gives the story a hostile pressure that no clean urban environment could provide. The trees, heat, mud, narrow movement, and constant sense of limited visibility make the mission feel like a descent. The characters are not just entering enemy territory, they are entering a living memory. Every path feels dangerous because every path feels connected to what happened before. That is where the film's rough visual texture becomes a strength. A smoother film might have made everything prettier, but not necessarily better. Cobra Mission benefits from grit. The practical locations, the military clothing, the sweat, the dirt, the hard daylight, and the shadow danger all support the feeling that these men are returning to a place that does not forgive anyone. The action works when it feels physical, not because every sequence is perfectly choreographed, but because the danger has weight. Men run, hide, fire, fall back, push forward, and react under pressure. The action is built around bodies in space, not empty spectacle. That gives the film a grounded force. You understand that every advance has a cost. Every mistake could close the trap. The music and sound also do important emotional work. The score gives the mission forward momentum, but it also carries a sense of sadness under the danger. That matters because this is not a celebratory adventure, it is a rescue mission wrapped around old grief. The sound of weapons, movement, shouting, engines, and tense silence becomes part of the film's nervous system. It keeps reminding you that war is not just something the characters remember. It is something the film keeps making present. But the one scene that feels completely unforgettable is the moment when the mission stops being theory and becomes undeniable truth. That moment when the men realize the prisoners are real, that the nightmare continued after the world stopped looking, changes the whole emotional temperature of the film. Before that, they are risking everything on belief. After that, they are carrying proof. And proof is heavier than suspicion. Proof removes the comfort of doubt. That is the scene that gives Cobra Mission its strongest meaning. Because once the prisoners are seen, the film is no longer only about whether the heroes can complete the mission. It becomes about whether anyone can live honesty after knowing what was hidden. The rescue becomes action, but the discovery becomes judgment. And that is what the film does best. It takes a familiar 1980s war action formula and gives it a wounded moral center. It may not always be elegant, but it has purpose. It understands anger. It understands loyalty. It understands the fantasy of men going back not because they love war, but because they cannot accept that brothers were left behind inside it. That is why Cobra Mission still has a pulse. Not because every part is perfect, because the mission matters. Where Cobra Mission falls short is in the same place many films of this type fall short. It has a powerful emotional idea, but it does not always slow down enough to let that idea breathe. The biggest weakness is character depth. The film gives us men with history, trauma, loyalty, anger, and unfinished guilt, but not every character receives the same emotional weight. You understand the shape of their pain. You understand why the mission matters. But sometimes you want more private moments between them, more small details, more memories that reveal who they were before the war turned them into survivors. That matters because the story depends on brotherhood. If the bond between these men is the engine of the film, then every character should feel individually necessary, not only functionally useful. Some of them do. Others feel more like parts of the mission machine. One is a leader, one carries anger, one adds tension, one brings experience. That works for action structure. But emotionally, the film could have gone further. It could have made every man's reason for returning feel sharply personal. The pacing also has uneven spots. The film moves with purpose once the mission is active, but some transitions feel abrupt. Certain story turns arrive because the genre needs them to arrive, not because the drama has fully earned them. That does not destroy the experience, but it does make the film feel rougher than it needs to be. A little more patience could have made the emotional payoff stronger. Look closer at the setup. The idea of returning to Southeast Asia to rescue abandoned prisoners is heavy. It carries political anger, moral guilt, and personal trauma. But the film sometimes treats that weight as a launchpad more than a full dramatic space. It wants to get to the mission, and you can feel that urgency. For our action fans, that keeps the film moving. But for viewers looking for deeper psychological exploration, it can feel like the movie is running past its own strongest material. There are also logic gaps that is common in this genre, but it still matters. The mission sometimes depends on convenience. Information appears when the plot needs it. Danger rises and falls according to action rhythm rather than strict realism. The team makes choices that feel emotionally understandable but not always tactically careful. In a more grounded war thriller, those details would be serious problems. Here they are easier to accept because the film is operating as a pulpy rescue fantasy, but they still keep it from reaching a higher level. The politics are another limitation. Cobra Mission is angry at abandonment and official silence, and that anger gives the film strength. But the political world around that anger is painted in very broad strokes. The film knows who it wants you to distrust. It knows what emotional conclusion it wants to reach, but it does not always explore the complexity behind that world. It turns institutional failure into a clear villainous force, which is effective for action cinema, but less satisfying if you want nuance. And then there is the tonal issue. The film wants to be a serious story about trauma and betrayal, while also delivering explosive 1980s action entertainment. Sometimes those two sides support each other beautifully. The action becomes the language of buried pain. But sometimes the spectacle risks simplifying the suffering underneath. The emotional ideas are strong, but the genre packaging can make them feel louder than they are deep. Still, these flaws do not erase the film's appeal. They define its level. Cobra Mission is not a masterpiece of war cinema. It is a committed, rugged, emotionally charged action film with limitations you can clearly see. Its weaknesses come from speed, bluntness, and underdevelopment, but its strengths come from exactly the same source. It does not hesitate, it does not soften itself. It goes straight for the wound and turns that wound into movement. That means the flaws matter, but they do not break the box. They simply show us what kind of box this is. To understand Cobra Mission, you have to place it inside the crowded war action box of the 1980s. because this film is not standing alone. It is part of a whole cinematic wave where Vietnam was no longer only a historical event. It had become a wound that action cinema kept trying to reopen, rewrite, and resolve. The most obvious comparison is Missing in Action. That film turns the abandoned prisoner idea into a direct revenge rescue fantasy. It is cleaner, more iconic, and built around a much more recognizable action star image. Chuck Norris becomes the symbol of one man doing what governments fail to do. Cobra Mission operates in the same emotional territory, but it feels rougher and more ensemble driven. It does not have the same clean heroic mythology. Instead of one unstoppable figure cutting through the silence, it gives us a group of damaged men returning together. That makes it less polished, but also gives it a different flavor. The paying fees shed. Then you have Rambo First Blood Part 2. That comparison is impossible to avoid. Both films are built around the idea of going back into the jungle, finding prisoners, and exposing official failure. But Rambo is mythic. It turns one haunted veteran into almost a supernatural force of survival. The body becomes the message. The action becomes emotional revenge against the country that used him and rejected him. Cobra Mission is smaller, less operatic, and less visually iconic, but it lives in the same emotional shadow. It wants the same release, the fantasy that someone can return to the scene of betrayal and force the truth into the open. Where Cobra Mission falls short beside Rambo is scale and cinematic clarity. Rambo has stronger imagery, sharper action identity, and a more memorable central figure. But where Cobra Mission holds its own is in the team dynamic. It is less about one legend and more about the brotherhood trying to answer a shared wound. Another strong comparison is Uncommon Valor. That film also deals with prisoners left behind and a privately organized rescue attempt. But Uncommon Valor has a more dramatic grief-centered setup. It spends more time with the emotional cost of waiting, believing, and refusing to accept official closure. Cobra Mission is more blunt and more action driven. It does not explore grief with the same patience, but it does share the same moral obsession. If someone may still be alive, then silence becomes impossible to accept. And then there is The Deer Hunter, which is a very different kind of film. That is not an action comparison, it is an emotional comparison. The Deer Hunter is deeper, more tragic, more human, and far more patient with trauma. It looks at how war breaks people long after the violence ends. Cobra Mission does not reach that level of psychological depth, but it does touch the same basic fear in a more pulpy way. The fear that war follows you home, waits inside you, and eventually demands to be faced again. So what does Cobra Mission do that others in the genre do not? It gives the rescue fantasy an international genre texture. It feels like a European action film wearing the skin of an American Vietnam story. That makes it stranger and rougher than its Hollywood relatives. It does not have their polish, but it has a raw video era personality. You can feel the marketplace it came from. You can feel the VHS shelf. You can feel the hunger for hard, direct, morally angry action. If you loved Cobra Mission, watch Missing in Action for the sharper, star-driven version of the same fantasy. Watch Rambo First Blood Part 2 for the mythic, explosive version. Watch Uncommon Valor if you want the emotional rescue angle handled with more dramatic weight. But if Cobra Mission did not work for you, and you wanted a deeper, more serious exploration of Vietnam trauma, watch The Deer Hunter or Born on the 4th of July instead. Those films are not trying to give you the same action release. They are trying to sit with the pain. That is the key difference. Cobra Mission does not meditate on the wound, it charges straight into it. The world Cobra Mission arrived into was already obsessed with unfinished war. By 1986, Vietnam had become more than a historical subject in action cinema. It had become a cinematic wound that different filmmakers kept reopening from different angles. Some films approached it through grief, some through political anger, some through psychological collapse. And then there was the 1980s rescue fantasy, where veterans returned to Southeast Asia to find prisoners, expose betrayal, and force a kind of victory that history never gave them. Cobra Mission belongs directly to that moment. This was after Uncommon Valor, after missing in action and right in the shadow of Rambo First Blood Part 2. The 1985 blockbuster that turned the PAW rescue premise into one of the defining action myths of the decade. Rambo First Blood Part 2 specifically sends John Rambo back to Vietnam to confirm reports of missing prisoners, only for the mission to become a rescue after official orders fail morally. And once that film exploded globally, the market was ready for more stories built from the same emotional fuel. That is why Cobra Mission feels so tied to its era. It is not just copying a trend, it is responding to a cultural hunger. Audiences were watching stories where the individual soldier did what governments would not. That fantasy mattered because it reversed helplessness. It took a messy, painful, politically complicated war and turned it into a mission with a clear target, clear betrayal, and clear action. In real life, history does not offer clean emotional closure. In movies like this, closure could be fought for with weapons, loyalty, and sacrifice. That does not make the film realistic. It makes it revealing. The political mood around these films was built on distrust. The idea that official institutions had hidden truths, abandoned soldiers, or rewritten failure into silence was powerful genre material. Cobra Mission leans hard into that feeling. Its story of former Marines returning after reports of POWs still being held, then uncovering a secret government unwillingness to expose the truth, fits that exact 1980s anxiety. Critically, this was never positioned like a prestige war drama. It was a low-cost Vietnam action film, and even Italian-language summaries describe it as a typical 1980s Vietnam movie, despite its low budget. That context is important. The film was not trying to sit beside the most serious American war dramas as a quiet psychological document. It was built for impact, for genre audiences, for people who wanted jungle action mixed with moral outrage, and the reception reflects that split. Some contemporary Italian commentary, as summarized in available Italian film references, saw the film as politically ambitious but not fully convincing in its conclusion, while another cited view criticized the filmmaking sharply, but still acknowledged that the dramatic denunciation in the finale had a certain dignity. That is almost the perfect summary of Cobra Mission. It is flawed, it is rough, it is blunt, but it is not empty. There is a genuine idea burning inside the chaos. Awards were never the point here. This is not a film remembered through trophies or festival prestige. Its real afterlife is in the world of action collectors, VHS era memory, international titles, cult reviews, and rediscovery by people digging through forgotten corners of 1980s genre cinema. It even received a sequel, Cobra Mission 2, released a few years later, which shows that the title had enough market life to continue. Its streaming life also tells you something about its place in film culture. This is not a title that lives permanently on every major platform. Availability can shift by region, and current Just Watch data for the United States lists no online streaming offer for Cobra Mission at the time check. That kind of scarcity changes how a film becomes remembered. It becomes less of a mainstream rewatch and more of a cult object, something people discover through discs, old copies, niche platforms, genre blogs, and action film communities. So does Cobra Mission feel timeless? Not exactly, it feels intensely of its era. The politics, the pacing, the masculinity, the rescue fantasy, the distrust of government, the jungle war imagery, even the rough international production texture, all scream made 1980s action cinema. But that does not weaken it. In fact, it makes the film more interesting. It is like a time capsule from a period when action movies were trying to turn national trauma into physical confrontation. And that is the cultural key. Cobra Mission is not timeless because it escapes 1986. It matters because it traps 1986 inside the box. The fan theory layer around Cobra Mission is unusual because this is not one of those films with a massive online theory culture where thousands of people are dissecting every frame. It is more of a cult action title, the kind of movie people rediscover through old video releases, genre blogs, action forums, and retro review spaces. So the theories here are less about hidden puzzle box mythology and more about interpretation, what the film is really saying beneath its direct rescue mission surface. The first theory is that the mission is not really a rescue mission at all. It is a revenge ritual disguised as rescue. On the surface, the men return because they believe American prisoners may still be alive in Southeast Asia, and public plot summaries consistently frame the story around former Marines investigating reports of POWs still being held after the war. But look closer at the emotional behavior of the team. They are not simply motivated by evidence, they are motivated by the need to feel useful again. The possibility of rescuing prisoners gives them a moral reason to return, but underneath that reason is something darker. They want to re enter the only world where their pain makes sense. That theory holds up because the film keeps connecting action with identity. These men do not just remember war, they are shaped by it. The mission gives them a target, but it also gives them back a version of themselves. And that is uncomfortable because the film is asking whether heroism and obsession can sometimes look almost the same from the outside. The second theory is that the real villain of Cobra Mission is not the enemy camp, it is official silence. This theory is strongly supported by the film's own plot. Several public synopses described the veterans discovering PAWs and learning about a secret American effort to keep that knowledge buried. That means the jungle danger is only the visible enemy. The invisible enemy is the system that decides which truths are too inconvenient to admit. This is where the film becomes more interesting than simple action. The gunfire is loud, but the betrayal is colder. The enemy in front of the characters can be fought. The silence behind them is harder to defeat. And if you read the film this way, the entire mission becomes an attempt to drag hidden truths into daylight. The third theory is that Richard and the others are not trying to save the prisoners first. They are trying to save the part of themselves that was left behind. This one is more interpretive, but it fits the emotional pattern. The characters are veterans who cannot settle into peace. They seem disconnected from ordinary life. When the possibility of returning appears, it does not feel like a normal decision. It feels like a compulsion. They are pulled back because some piece of their identity never came home. That is why the jungle can be read almost like a psychological space. It is not only a location, it is memory with trees around it. Every step deeper into danger becomes a step deeper into the part of their past they never processed. The prisoners are real inside the story, but symbolically they also represent the trapped selves of the men trying to rescue them. The fourth theory is about the ending. Some cult reviewers have pointed out that the ending is sadder and more thoughtful than the standard betrayed by the government action template, with one retro review calling it surprisingly reasonable and memorable for this kind of movie. That opens a strong reading. The film may not fully believe in clean victory. It gives you the action release, but it does not let the wound disappear. Rescue does not erase abandonment. Truth does not automatically create justice. Survival does not equal peace. And that theory holds up best of all, because Cobra Mission is not really asking whether the men can complete the operation. It is asking whether completing the operation can actually repair what was broken. The answer is complicated. The film supports the idea that going back matters. It supports loyalty. It supports the refusing to forget the abandoned. But it also suggests that the past cannot be fully corrected. You can open the box. You can expose what was hidden. You can pull people out of the darkness. But you cannot pretend the darkness was never there. That is the fan theory layer that matters most. Cobra Mission may look like a straightforward war action film, but underneath, it is a story about men trying to rescue proof, identity, brotherhood, and meaning from a war that officially ended before it emotionally released them. And now that those theories are open, we can go one level deeper into what the film is really about beneath the mission, beneath the weapons, and beneath the jungle. Beneath the weapons, beneath the jungle, beneath the rescue mission, Cobra Mission is really about unfinished responsibility. That is the deeper layer. The film is not only asking whether these men can go back and bring prisoners home. It is asking what happens when responsibility survives longer than the war that created it. A uniform can be removed, orders can end, governments can move on, newspapers can stop talking. But inside the people who live through it, responsibility does not disappear just because the world has decided the chapter is closed. That is why the film's central mission feels heavier than a normal action objective. These men are not chasing treasure, they are not protecting a random target. They are not fighting because the plot needs explosions. They are moving because somewhere deep inside them they believe a promise was broken, and that promise is not written on paper. It is not official, it is not clean, it is the promise soldiers make without saying it. If we survive together, we do not abandon each other. That idea gives the film its emotional weight. Because abandonment is a real monster here, not just physical abandonment where men are left behind in a hostile place, emotional abandonment too, political abandonment, cultural abandonment, the abandonment of veterans who come home and realize the world wants their silence more than their truth. The abandonment of memory when history becomes too uncomfortable to keep looking at directly. Cobra Mission turns that fear into action. The jungle becomes more than a location. It becomes the place where everything unresolved is hiding. Every path feels like memory. Every shadow feels like guilt. Every step forward feels like the characters are walking deeper into something they try to bury. That is why the environment matters so much. The jungle is not just dangerous because enemies may be there. It is dangerous because it forces the characters to become who they were again, and that is one of the saddest ideas in the film. These men may feel most alive in the place that damaged them most. Look closer at that. In ordinary life, they are restless, angry, isolated, or out of place. But once the mission begins, their instincts return. They know how to move. They know how to survive. They understand danger better than peace. The tragedy is that peace should have been the reward, but peace has become the environment where they feel least understood. That is what the film is really touching. War does not only hurt people by what happens during it, it hurts them by changing what feels normal afterward. A quiet room can feel strange, safety can feel fake, ordinary conversation can feel meaningless. And when a mission appears, even a dangerous one, it can feel like purpose returning. That is the painful contradiction at the center of Cobra Mission. The men are not romanticized because they want danger. They are tragic because danger is the only language that still organizes their pain. The prisoners deepen that meaning. Inside the story, they are people who must be saved, but symbolically, they are also proof that the past is still alive. They are the living evidence of everything the world tried to forget. When the characters search for them, they are also searching for confirmation that their own pain was not meaningless, that their suspicion was not madness, that the inability to move on was connected to something real. That is why discovery matters so much. To find the prisoners is to find truth. But truth does not automatically heal. This is where the film becomes more human than it first appears. It understands maybe more through instinct than elegance that exposing a wound is not the same as closing it. You can rescue people and still be haunted by how long they were left there. You can uncover betrayal and still have no easy way to repair the damage. You can complete the mission and still carry the knowledge that the mission should never have been necessary. That is the deeper sadness of the box. The film gives us action because action is satisfying. It gives us movement because movement feels like control. But underneath all of that, it is dealing with a truth that cannot be solved by force alone. Some losses cannot be reversed. Some silences cannot be forgiven easily. Some wars keep living inside the people who survive them. And this is why Cobra Mission still has meaning beyond its genre formula. It may be rough, it may be blunt, it may not have the polish of a major war drama, but its emotional idea is strong. It understands that being left behind is not only something that happens in a prison camp, it can happen inside a country, inside a memory, inside a man who came home but never felt fully welcomed back into life. That is what the film is really about. Not victory, not revenge, not even rescue alone. It is about the need to open a locked room in history and say, these lives mattered, this pain mattered, this truth should not have been buried. And once you see that, the mission becomes something larger than survival. It becomes an act of remembrance. The legacy of Cobra Mission is not the legacy of a film that changed cinema overnight. It did not redefine the war genre. It did not become the major Vietnam action title everyone quotes first. It did not step into film history with the same force as Rambo, First Blood Part 2, Missing in Action, or the more serious Vietnam dramas that shaped critical conversation. But that does not mean it has no legacy. Its legacy is smaller, rougher, and more specific. Cobra Mission belongs to the video era bloodstream. It is one of those films that reminds you how powerful the 1980s action market really was. A movie did not need to be a Hollywood giant to travel. It could be made through an international production system, carry multiple titles, borrow the emotional language of American war drama, and still reach viewers looking for hard-edged jungle action. Cobra Mission, also known as Operation Arm, was an Italian West German production directed by Fabrizio De Angelis under the Larry Ludman credit. And it even received a sequel, Cobra Mission 2, released in 1988. That sequel matters not because it turned the film into a massive franchise, but because it proves the original had enough market identity to continue. In the world of 1980s genre cinema, that is influence of a different kind. Not influence as prestige, influence as survival. The title had value. The premise had value. The image of veterans returning to dangerous territory still had commercial power. What Cobra Mission represents is the international echo of a very American wound. That is its most important historical meaning. The film shows how the Vietnam rescue fantasy moved beyond American studios and became part of global action cinema. European filmmakers were not only imitating the surface of American military movies, they were absorbing the emotional formula, abandoned soldiers, distrust of officials, masculine guilt, jungle danger, and the dream of correcting a broken past through direct action. That formula shaped many films around this period. Some had bigger stars, some had sharper action, some had stronger political anger. But Cobra Mission sits inside the same pattern, and its roughness makes that pattern easier to see. It shows the skeleton of the genre clearly. The mission, the team, the betrayal, the prisoners, the return. The belief that if institutions fail, wounded men must step into the gap. Its reputation over time has not grown into mainstream respect, but it has found the kind of second life that many exploitation and low budget action films receive. It lives through collectors, genre fans, retro reviewers, cast completists, and people fascinated by Italian and European action cinema. Modern catalog listings still connect the film to names like Oliver Tobias, Christopher Connelly, Manfred Lehmann, John Steiner, Ethan Wayne, and Donald Pleasance, which gives it continuing interest for viewers who follow genre actors across forgotten corners of cinema. And that is important. Sometimes a film's legacy is not about being universally loved. Sometimes it is about preserving a mood. Cobra Mission preserves the mood of 1986 action cinema almost perfectly. Distrustful, bruised, loud, masculine, angry, and hungry for closure. It captures a moment when movies were trying to transform unresolved political pain into missions that could be completed, enemies that could be confronted, and truths that could be dragged into the open. Does it influence modern cinema directly? Not in a clean, obvious line. You do not watch today's war films and say, this came from Cobra Mission. But you can watch modern action stories about abandoned operatives, hidden military truths, unofficial rescue teams, and broken veterans pulled back into violence, and feel the same genre DNA still moving underneath. The specific title may be cult level, but the pattern it belongs to never disappeared. That is the real legacy. Cobra Mission is a small box inside a much larger box. It is not the masterpiece of its movement, but it is a clear artifact of that movement. It shows us what 1980s action cinema feared, what it wanted, what it simplified, and what it could not stop returning to. The war ends, the mission does not. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now. Go watch it and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'd want to experience it fresh. The biggest twist in Cobra Mission is not simply that the prisoners are real. The bigger twist is what their existence reveals about the world around them. The film begins with 4 former Marines returning to Southeast Asia after hearing that American POWs may still be alive years after the Vietnam War. But the moment they confirm those reports, the story stops being just a rescue mission and becomes a moral accusation. Richard, Roger, James, and Mark are not walking into the jungle as clean heroes. They are walking in as damaged men chasing a truth that may destroy whatever peace they have left. Roger has family ties and a life that should have held him in place. James carries the emptiness of unemployment and dislocation. Mark has walked away from his own routine. Richard has already been marked by psychological collapse. The detail matters because the film is not pretending these men are perfectly adjusted warriors. They are unstable because the past has never finished with them. When they arrive in Saigon and connect with Father Lenoir, the mission gains a spiritual shadow. He is not just the helpful contact who moves the plot forward. He is the film's witness. Through him, the men step into a world where the official version of history has already failed. He guides them toward the truth, but he also represents the cost of knowing too much. In this story, knowledge is dangerous because it does not only expose the enemy, it exposes everyone who benefited from silence. Public synopses describe this old religious figure as helping the men find the camp where American prisoners are still held. The first major turning point is the discovery of the POW camp. Up to that moment, the mission could still be dismissed as obsession. Maybe these veterans are chasing ghosts. Maybe drama has made them believe in a story they need to be true. But once the prisoners are found, doubt dies. The rumor becomes flesh, the nightmare becomes visible, and that changes the emotional meaning of every scene before it. Because now Richard and the others were not crazy to return. They were right, and being right is almost worse. That is the cruelest part of the film. If the prisoners had not existed, the veterans would have been tragic men trapped by memory. But because the prisoners are real, their pain becomes evidence, their suspicion becomes truth. Their inability to move on becomes a kind of moral clarity. The film uses that reveal to turn the audience's excitement into discomfort. You want the rescue to succeed, but you also feel the horror of how late it is. The rescue itself is messy, urgent, and incomplete. The group manages to free a significant number of surviving prisoners, but not all of them. That detail is important because it prevents the ending from becoming pure wish fulfillment. A cleaner action movie might have given us total success. All prisoners saved, all villains defeated, all wounds closed. Cobra Mission refuses that. It lets success arrive with failure still inside it, and this is where the ending becomes darker than expected. The men learn that the real betrayal is not only in the jungle, it is back home, inside the machinery of power. The authorities already knew enough. They understood that prisoners remained, and they understood the suffering attached to that fact. But political agreements and larger interests mattered more than rescue. The film frames this as a cold institutional decision. Some truths are inconvenient and inconvenient truths are buried. That is the film's real villain. Not only the soldiers guarding the camp, not only the jungle, not only the danger in front of the team, the real villain is the decision to look away. And that makes the final stretch bitter. The mission proves the truth, but proving the truth does not automatically give the heroes justice. In fact, it places them in even more danger. Once they know what has been hidden, they become a problem. They are no longer only veterans, they are witnesses. And witnesses are dangerous when the official story depends on silence. Look closer at the hidden details. Richard's earlier instability is not just character background, it becomes foreshadowing. The film prepares us to understand how easily truth can be dismissed if the person carrying it has already been labeled unreliable. That is one of the coldest ideas in the movie. If a damaged veteran says something terrible is being hidden, the system can point to his damage and use it against him. Father Lenoir works the same way symbolically. He represents conscience in a world that has become political. His help matters because the men need more than weapons. They need someone who still believes that human life is more important than official convenience. In a louder film, that could have become sentimental. Here, it gives the story a sad moral spine. Then the final implication lands. Some versions and retro discussions emphasize a deeply bleak aftermath. Roger and James die soon after the mission under suspicious or sudden circumstances, while Richard ends up back in a mental hospital, with the suggestion that the surviving witnesses have been neutralized or silenced. That ending hits hard because it refuses heroic closure. The men went back. They found the prisoners. They exposed the lie. They survived the jungle. And still, the system remains. That is why the ending feels less like victory and more like a warning. The film gives us action release, but then it pulls the ground away. It suggests that individual bravery can reveal truth, but truth can still be contained by power. The mission opens a box, but the world immediately tries to close it again. My personal reaction to the ending is that it makes Cobra Mission more interesting than its surface promises. The film may be rough, but the final idea is genuinely sharp. It understands that betrayal afterward can be quieter than combat and more devastating than an ambush. The jungle may be where the men risk their lives, but the real danger is the country that no longer wants them to speak. And that connects directly back to the deeper meaning. Cobra Mission is not only about rescuing prisoners, it is about rescuing truth from silence. The ending says that some men are left behind physically and others are left behind psychologically. The prisoners are trapped in the camp. The veterans are trapped in memory. Richard is trapped in an institution. Roger and James are trapped by what they know. Everyone is caught inside a system that turns human pain into something manageable, deniable, and disposable. So when the film closes, the box is open, but it is not comforting. Inside, we find loyalty, we find guilt, we find courage, we find betrayal. And most of all, we find the terrible cost of a truth that powerful people never wanted recovered. So, where do we land with Cobra Mission? For me, this is a 6.4 out of 10. And that rating feels right because this is not a film I would call great in the clean, polished, classic sense. It has rough edges. It has moments where the drama needed more silence, more depth, more patience. It has characters who could have been written with sharper individual identities. It has action that works through grit and energy more than elegance. And yes, it belongs very clearly to a specific 1980s wave of Vietnam rescue cinema, which means some of its ideas feel locked inside the politics and style of that era. But here's the thing, a film can be imperfect and still have a pulse. Cobra Mission has that pulse. It has a mission that matters emotionally. It has wounded men walking back into the place that shaped them. It has anger toward abandonment, distrust toward official silence, and a powerful belief that forgotten lives should not stay forgotten simply because remembering them is uncomfortable. That gives the movie more weight than its surface might suggest. If you love old school war action, jungle rescue stories, VHS era toughness, and films where damaged men turn guilt into movement, you should watch this. Not because it is flawless, but because it captures a very particular action cinema mood, bruised, direct, angry, and hungry for closure. If you prefer war films with deep psychological realism, careful political complexity, or major studio polish, this one may not fully connect with you. It may feel too blunt, too fast, too rough, too committed to genre impact over emotional nuance. For me, this is a streaming watch or a cult disc discovery, not necessarily a film you need to own unless you collect 1980s action cinema. But if you are exploring the darker corners of the Vietnam rescue cycle, Cobra Mission belongs in the conversation. Because this is a film about men who go back for prisoners, but really return for proof. Proof that the past mattered. Proof that silence was not the same as peace. Proof that some boxes stay locked until someone is brave enough or broken enough to open them. Every film is a box, and we open this one together. Tough told, outro, continuing. And that brings us to the end of our breakdown of Cobra Mission. Thank you for opening this film with me here on the Film Box. This was not the cleanest movie we have ever explored, and it was definitely not the most polished, but that is exactly why it was worth looking at closely. Sometimes the rough films tell us just as much as the masterpieces. Sometimes they show us what an era wanted, what it feared, and what it could not stop repeating. If this breakdown helped you see Cobra Mission differently, hit like, subscribe, and stay with the channel because we are opening more films layer by layer, the famous ones, the forgotten ones, the strange ones, and the ones hiding more meaning than people expect. And now I want to know your take. Do you think Cobra Mission works best as a simple 1980s action rescue movie, or do you think the ending makes it darker and more meaningful than people give it credit for? Drop your thoughts in the comments because that is where the box keeps opening. Next time, we are stepping into another film where the surface gives us action, but the deeper layer gives us something much more complicated. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.